So by now, I know you're not on Facebook,
Nope.
but I know you're on Twitter, so I know you get your information.
Yes.
And so I know that you are aware of the revival that broke out in Asbury.
Absolutely.
And so
yes.
that wrapped up, that finished.
Mm-hmm.
But a staff member sent me a Facebook article that was chronicling, like, I guess LSU and Texas A&M and Georgia and Baylor, they have been talking about that they've been having outbreaks of revival and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought that it'd be an interesting conversation for us to have, just like, how do we feel about that? Like, do we think revival is something that would happen? What comes to mind when you think about revival? Like, just what's your overall thought on that whole experience?
The thing about revival for me is, as somebody who grew up in traditional Southern church, we used to have revivals that were scheduled.
Yes.
And sometimes you'd have a spring and a fall revival.
Right.
And they basically consist of you bringing in a guest speaker, usually somebody who was a buddy of your pastor,
Okay.
who could come in and he would preach his best evangelistic sermons for like 4 or 5 nights. And you'd have some special music and you'd invite the community. You put signs up that say revival this week. And then your buddy would collect that, your pastor's buddy would collect a paycheck, and then everybody would go right back to where you were. So, like, that's my vision of revival.
And I see that, right?
And so it revival to me is like, the word is like been tainted, because I honestly I never saw revival.
Right.
Like, I never actually saw what people want to think they think revival is.
Correct.
And a lot of times that practice of the church developed out of sincere movements of God, where people said, "Oh, that was awesome. We should copy that."
Yeah.
And so if we call something what that was, then this is going to be the same thing. And I think what happened at Asbury seemed to be very sincere, because it wasn't like, it
wasn't a program.
I mean, Greg Laurie didn't come in,
Right.
and there wasn't a crusade and,
Right.
an advanced team that came in
Right.
and set up everything with all the local churches and invite all the local community. It just happened.
Right.
And then in our culture, because of social media, whenever something's going on, there are certain people that want to tag along, right? And certain people want to be a part of it. And so there was some of that. I heard that there were, some Christian recording artists who were calling and trying to say, "Hey, do you want us to come and help lead worship?" And they were like, "No, we got it." Like, God's already moving. Like, God's not going to move more just because you have a record deal, to come in and lead worship. So there was always all that kind of tension and that back and forth. And then there were people questioning, what was going on. And so for me, I just have a lot of questions, a lot of curiosities coming out of my cynical brain, man. Because, like, I know all the statistics of, like, the Billy Graham Crusades coming in.
I know.
And then, like, the weeks following the Crusades coming in, and, hundreds of people going down accepting Jesus, and there was not an appreciable influx in people attending church in that community over the next few weeks. And it was almost like, okay, well, what really happened? What really took place?
Right.
What really occurred? And so wouldn't it be awesome if there was a movement among college kids who people think in general have totally, like, disconnected from the faith? Like, if that was genuinely going on, let's celebrate that. That's kind of the way I feel about it. But
So on paper, it checked a lot of boxes that I like to see.
okay.
That it wasn't scripted. It was just their Wednesday night worship that they had, and that they went into prayer, and that a student kind of stood up to prayer, just really give a testimony, whatever it was.
Right.
And it just spawned this thing where the night just wanted to continue to go on. And for that, it just moved naturally. Like, it was kind of like, let's give way for the Spirit. Let's move out the way.
Right.
What really started to bother me is that I did start seeing a lot of the Christians, just like from all over, like people came from other countries to fly in.
Right.
This is kind of like, to me, it's kind of like what, like, I mean, I understand, like, I want to maybe go see, like you said before, I haven't really maybe seen this before. And so you want to be there, but, like, it was a lot of this, like, let me just go see, like, tag along. Like, that's a good cookie from the Girl Scouts, but maybe is that the best thing for us to do, is always be tagging along.
tag
right?
along.
Yeah, you know what I'm saying? And so like, you know, I was kind of like, why are we doing this? Like,
Yeah.
what's going on with that?
Yeah.
And then I felt like it was more Christian news. Like it was more people in churches were talking about it more.
Okay.
And for me, I was kind of like, you want to see revival? Like, what do you want to see revival? You want to see for the lost? Like, you would think that in my mind, it's coming and God seeking and saving the lost, right? Like he's not coming for the well, he's coming for the sick. Okay. And so like it's not for us to get re-energized. Like it's not really for us.
But by definition, revival is waking something that was dead.
So
right?
maybe it could be dead faith. So to your point, so maybe it could be a shake. I mean,
like,
all that,
like apathy in the church awakening, right. You know, and so I don't really know what that. In other words, when people say revival, is that what they mean, or are they saying like the gospel is moving into uncharted territories? I guess that really is key to the conversation, because the people there were obviously Christian, mostly Christian. I would say predominantly, because they're at a Christian event on campus, at a chapel service. And so I think it's, by definition, in that instance, revival was God's doing something fresh, and there's maybe some barriers being broken and some walls coming down, and some things needed to be reset or being reset in the hearts of those kids. And I think that's fantastic. That's awesome if that's what it was. So I think sometimes people can be critical of, well, that's not really revival because, you know, how many people are you baptizing? People always want to go to the numbers and to start to quantify like whether you're successful or not.
And that's what a lot of people were doing.
And so but is that really what revival is? I don't really know. I mean, for me, revival is it's an awakening from within the church to go and to do what the church has been called to do.
Yeah.
Like the difference between a crusade, we want to reach the lost community versus a revival. We want to renew ourselves to go do a crusade. Like I know I like to get into the weeds of like, what does your words actually mean? And I think sometimes people want to say a revival is, well, we're going to reach our community for the lost. Okay, that's awesome. But I mean, shouldn't that be the mission of your church every week?
I think that a lot of people go back to they call the Great Awakening a revival. And the Great Awakening was when it felt that people who were not Christian had a renewed hunger for God's things.
Right.
And I believe that that's kind of what they're trying to say with this, with these college kids, is there a revival going on within this generation? Because I've been reading a lot where like God's calling this generation to be like, I want to bring you back. And so I think it's kind of both and like it's on a Christian college, right. But like Texas A&M is not a Christian college.
No.
Like Baylor is not. So like that. So then it's like, well, then is that a real move of God, or is that a move of social media? Like, is that a move of I don't want to be left out? And I'm not trying to be too cynical. I'm just saying like, that's what I'm kind of believing. Like, do you believe that God is still in the business of using the tool of a revival?
Well, it's hard for me because I mean, you and I have been around church and church leadership all of our lives for the most part, for a long time. And so we've seen a lot of things. We've seen a lot of youth conferences, and, you know, the altar call, the youth conference is always going to get a lot of response. And it sometimes it feels like, and you can identify there are some kids that are deeply touched by God. Yeah. And then there are some kids who are just caught up in the moment. Okay. And because other people are going, they're going to. Okay. So I think there's always going to be a little bit of that, like a little bit of, okay, it's a social movement to some extent as much as it is a spiritual movement.
Like Jesus always drew large crowds,
right?
Stuff like that. Right?
You know, and he would say, "Are you just coming for a sign?
Yeah.
Like, what do you, why? You know, what do you need from me?
Right.
And so I think that to me is a little bit of the issue. Is it genuine? I think people want the genuine article. Like if God really was awakening the college campuses across our country, I think it would become obvious because of the extended fruit of that movement.
Yes.
And I think that is what I would long to see and love to see. And I think it's also interesting that this is taking place in the season of deconstruction. Like, that word has become so popular, especially within Christian circles. You know, you've had people who were deep in the faith, and then they've deconstructed, is the way they say it. In other words, they've had a crisis of faith, and they have felt like a questioning of their beliefs to the point where some of them just leave Christianity altogether. And so in the wake of that, a lot of times that's happening in that generation, that younger generation. A lot of times that occurs for them. And so to see the opposite of that, like I'm not deconstructing, I'm actually reconstructing. I'm deepening, I'm strengthening, I'm building my faith and my attention to faith. And so that, to me, if nothing else, it's encouraging to see the opposite press or the opposite narrative in that age group, based on what we've seen from all the deconstruction talk.
Yeah, I don't know. I think for me, it's difficult to reconcile the idea of people want a revival and like they long for that, and most people would say that they do, like they want to see that, right? But then it's hard for me to, like, they long for that. But then they can't get into their mind that revival is available every Sunday. That each and every time that you worship collectively together on Sunday, or in your private home when you're doing your own study, or in a small group setting, that revival is readily available for that. And it's just odd, because for you and I, like, we understand that, like, preparing for a Sunday is like fishing, okay? We're going to go out there, and we're going to make sure we got our tackle together. We're going to make sure our lines are good. We got our lures.
We're going to dig up the worms.
We're going to get the worms. We're going to make sure we got a lunch. We're going to get everything we need. We're going to make sure we have other stuff to take care of if we need to swap things out. We're going to do some research on the pond we're going to get. We're going to know what kind of fish they have in there. We're going to know what season it is for what you're going to do. And we're going to go out there, and we're going to cast it, and we're going to put the time in.
Right.
But we can't control the bite.
Nope.
We just have to be ready for it.
Yeah.
And I feel that's the way it is with Sunday. Sunday mornings is like that. And we're waiting to catch whatever it is. Like, God's going to come and pull it.
Right.
We want to be there. And then when it comes, and you see that moment where you're able to intersect, right? And we get it. And God is clearly there. And the Spirit is moving. But then the people miss it, because it wasn't how they were looking for it to happen. And I feel like that's what to me bothers me about the whole thing about revival. Is that, like, when you put a sign that says revival here, or revival is going on there, then that changes my mind. And so now I'm going to go either look for reasons that's not, or reason to validate that it is, right? Like my confirmation bias. And then I feel like it's hard for me to then say, is that just me or is it really God? And so I just like, why don't we take that same expectancy to where God says, I'm going to show up and speak to you. That's what we really want. We really want where God came and spoke. Because we got to understand that the idea comes from the Old Testament idea. Like, the Old Testament wasn't like the whole idea of like it coming and in an anticipatory fashion was the fact that we didn't have the Spirit with us at one time. So like Mount Carmel, Elijah, Moses, Joshua, like God coming to these people, and it was a big thing, and he came, and it was like, wow, we got to be there at this time to get this and move on. Like, it's that kind of idea. And then like God would come to the tabernacle at a certain time and be there, or he would come. You know what I'm saying? It's that idea of that. And so when you go to the New Testament, you realize that he says that my Spirit is with you all the time, that you can always now boldly come before my throne. And so like revival can happen. Like it's hard for me to realize, like, what are we really looking for when we say revival? Because like it seems like revival is a special time and place, where I feel like for us that are believers, or what we're trying to tell people is that there is no special time and place, that you have access 24/7 for the power of God to show up in your life.
Yeah, but don't you think, I mean, we've even been talking about this in our own congregational setting. Like there's a bubbling.
Here you go.
I mean, like it just. I know. We can almost feel the pressure. I know. You literally said it Sunday.
I did.
Like something is about to break.
I did.
In our church, you can just literally feel.
I know
that God is building to something, and we walk in every Sunday with the expectancy.
So then, why do you feel it is? Because you wouldn't disagree. I hear you. You're backing me up into what I just said, but you'd also agree with what I said. So then, what's the difference in your opinion? Because we do believe that God's going to show up every Sunday, but then why do we build it? Then why do we also say that we feel something's building up?
Look, in my whole ministry,
that's crazy.
I didn't really take preparation lightly for Sunday, like you just talked about.
Right.
We put a lot into that effort, but there was just so many times where I felt like, as a staff, as the leaders of those moments, we did everything right.
Yes.
And it was just like
a dud.
Yes, and in the sense that that nobody's coming for prayer, nobody, like, it's just and everybody just kind of left, and the conversations after the service weren't really spiritual conversations. You could just kind of tell.
Yes, correct.
And then there were other moments where, man, like, it's almost like when my feet hit the floor that morning, I just knew, like, God was going to show up, we say.
In a radical way.
Way.
Right. Yes.
And he did. And it's like, I never could, and that's one of the things that makes knowing God precious, is because we are so dependent on him.
Yes.
And sometimes we think we're dependent on our craftiness, we're dependent on our skills and our abilities to manage the segues and the transitions of a service beautifully.
The phrases that pay.
Right. And we want to make sure we do all that.
Yeah.
But by the same token, as you like to say, we can't manufacture a movement of God.
Exactly.
And so when it happens, that's what makes it so beautiful.
Right.
Is because it is spontaneous to us. It's not spontaneous to God. It's spontaneous to us, because there have been moments where we felt it, our staff has felt it, but we felt like the people we were leading didn't feel it.
But don't you believe that God wants to have a moment every time we're together?
Yeah.
When you believe that?
Absolutely.
Okay,
but
okay.
I just think that there has to be a collective receptivity.
That's exactly
in the room.
Yes.
Because those people at Asbury, they're getting together every week. I mean, they're still like, there were many gatherings before that didn't break out in revival. So what was the difference? There was some kind of collective receptivity in that moment to say, wow,
that's what I believe.
Like, we are the people of God.
Yes.
And let's just bathe in that for a minute. Let's stay in that.
And that's what I feel like, if somebody's asking me, is that I feel that's what our job is.
Yeah.
Is that instead of trying to say, let's put on a revival or like preach revival, I want to preach that like there's a frequency that we need to tune into. Because I was thinking about this as I was coming back over here, is that I was just thinking about that, like we said before, like the fishing analogy. Like, all I can do is put the hook in the water.
Yeah.
Like, I believe I'm trying to do the right thing. I'm trying to be at the right pond, right thing, and I'm trying to catch that spirit. I'm trying to catch that moment. And I don't know when it's going to be there,
right,
but I don't want to give up too soon. I want to be prepared, and like I want to turn the dial, and I want to believe if he says go on 99.9, put the dial to 99.9, and then turn the noise down and tune myself to find that space, because I do believe that every day he wants to have a connection with us. And I don't believe it's like a special thing. Like, it's not like a New Year's Eve, like we don't need December 31st to turn the page. Like, right. I feel the exact same way. And I feel like that's the job. Like people ask, what do you think about the revival? Like, man, I think it's great, whatever it is. But I think about like, why are we missing an opportunity to teach our people that if we can get to a place where our mind and our heart is receptive, that God wants to show up every day. That's true life change.
Yes. And I think what we've both seen in our ministries individually and collectively together, like, is we've seen revival happen all the time, but it may just be an individual. Like revival happening in one marriage that Sunday.
Yes.
In one family that next Sunday.
Correct.
And somebody who kind of wavered a little bit the next Sunday. And it's not this whole movement where nobody wants to go home. It's somebody wants to go home healed.
Yeah.
Somebody wants to go home with a better marriage, with better parenting, with a better work ethic. Like, and I think that really is the mission of the church on a week in, week out basis. It's that ongoing revival in individual souls. Sometimes it does bubble up when you have this collective receptivity, like we were just talking about, to like, we just want to bathe in the presence of God together. And I think sometimes that does happen. Obviously, we've seen it, we've experienced it. Even Sunday we were talking about it. So I feel like that, we're planning a night of worship during our Easter series. We know Easter, because why is Easter so big a lot of times? It's because people come with that collective anticipation that God's going to show up. And they expect it to be like a different service. People are going to come to a night of worship, and they're going to expect it. Our worship pastor, when he announced it, he was like, God's going to show up and reveal something to us. And so we come with that collective anticipation of that. But every Sunday is not like that. But every Sunday we expect that revival's happening in somebody's life every single week, right? I mean, that's the reason we do what we do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that that's just the I like that, because I did say on this past Sunday that I said it just a couple of days ago, that I do feel that something's happening. Like, I feel kind of like the cloud can only hold so much water, is what I said. Like it's going to have to rain eventually, because just so much stuff is going up. Like so much praise, so much just life change is happening, that I think it needs to happen. And I feel like it could be such a powerful idea. Like, as a minister, as a pastor, we're trying to like move our people in our field to be in alignment to get the most. Like, when it rains, I want the most water to spray down on these crops.
Right.
Because we know that if they can be there and they can be covered, they won't be the same.
Right.
And that's the thing that I feel like that's what revival means to me, is that, as I always say, like, when you look at the scripture, when people had a real encounter with Jesus, they weren't the same.
Right.
Like, they just weren't.
Right.
Like, they were either with him or they weren't. But they weren't the same.
No.
You could not stay where you were at. Like, he called you to something. And that's what I really feel that I hope people will get to, is that like, when it does happen, when you do feel God's presence, when you do feel you can take a drink from that well deeply, like, don't you feel and hope that like that they would just be radically different, that it would just be like you said, I'm going home and I'm going to be a different husband. I'm going to be a different parent. I'm going to be a different spouse. I'm going to be a different follower of Jesus. Like, that's the fruit you were kind of talking about that you want to see.
Absolutely. I mean, before I met my mother-in-law, I had never had homemade banana pudding.
Right.
I'd had banana pudding.
Correct.
But I had never had homemade banana pudding.
Correct.
Once you taste homemade banana pudding, where somebody has lovingly stood at the stove,
preach on
and they've stirred.
Take your time.
And they've stirred.
Take your time.
And they've stirred. And all that goodness just comes together, and it makes something that takes the box, like Jell-O, like, I never want to taste that. I'll never eat that again.
I never have also.
I'm so discriminatory against it now.
Yes.
Like, it's just, I'm biased against it to the point where I just cannot make myself eat
when
it.
people find out that's my favorite dessert too.
Right.
So when people find out about us,
Yes.
they'll say, "Oh, can I make that?" I'll stop them and say, "Well, how do you make it?"
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to be rude, but I don't want you to waste your time.
Right. But like, we know, because once you taste it,
Ooh, preach it, Paul.
it changes everything.
It's everything.
Like, you can't go back.
No.
And so I think that is
So good.
That's what we want people to see it and just feel. Like, if you could just taste that.
Just once.
Just once. Change your life forever. And you never go back to the other, because you recognize it's just fake.
That's very true.
It's an imitation of what the greatest of that could be. And I think sometimes people, they'll have a faith in, like, they'll be a Christian, but are they truly living in that intimacy with God, to where those moments where, a certain song hits a certain way on a Sunday morning, there's tears in their eyes? Do you feel God that way? Like, is that? And I'm not saying you have to be, weeping and just running around and just like,
rolling on the floor.
Can't move.
No,
I'm just
we're not
saying
that.
Are you moved?
Yes.
Are you stirred? Because I think that's revival. The revival is remembering. It's remembering who we are. It's remembering who we belong to. It's remembering the cost of our freedom. It's remembering the hope that we have. It's just remembering the presence of God and the intimacy that's there, that should be so precious to us, that it's something that we long for. And once we taste it, we don't ever want to go back.